Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this. Welcome to our next video. This is the one that's going to look at some mechanisms of speciation and macroevolution and some of those perhaps more controversial ideas of evolution. So let's get started with just this discussion. When we talk about mechanisms of evolution, we've discussed one primarily that we'll get to in a second. There's actually multiple ways that populations can change over time. And when we ask what can lead to changes in a gene pool over successive generations, recall what a gene pool is from our class conversation. A gene pool is just all of the different versions of genes in a population. So over time, what can lead to changes? And we've actually discussed this, of course, as natural selection. Natural selection is probably the most powerful evolutionary force that can lead to changes in a gene pool and therefore result in evolution. So when we look at how this plays out, if you look over here, we have a population here of 9 rabbits, and they're showing you the gene pool represented as having these 7 as having this blue version of a gene. This is a little simplification, but it works. And then 2 of them having this pink version, and the pink version is a beneficial one. So what we would expect to see over time is to see natural selection favor that one if that's the beneficial version of the gene. So here in generation 1, they're representing our gene pool as just 7 blue ones and 2 pink ones to represent what this looks like. And then if we can look at what happens in the next, through microevolution, through natural selection favoring one type over another, we see the gene pool gradually change so that perhaps over time the beneficial mutation, which let's say it's for, in this case, for coloration, is beneficial, leads to continued changes in the gene pool to where by the time we get to this generation, we see that there's been a shift in the gene pool. This is evolution. And this is evolution, in this case, we're assuming by natural selection. That is, the beneficial mutation, the beneficial form was favored, and the other form was not favored. And over time, we see a shift in the gene pool. Again, understand what a gene pool is. It's all of the genes in that population made up by all of its members, but gradually it shifts. And this change is natural selection. Oops. So, I want to summarize. Taking over many generations, then microevolution does result in gradual adaptation of a species. We see changes in the species over time. That's what I meant to say and skipped it. Okay, so that gets to a semi-controversial area about evolution, which is to distinguish micro versus macroevolution. Microevolution, which we just saw, was the changes in a gene pool over time that leads to these gradual changes. And over here you see an example of this, trying to show you, as we talk about differences in dog breeds, for example, these gradual shifts that do result in differences, but that's evolution on a very small scale. When we're talking about macroevolution, we're talking about big, substantial changes. Here we're going from a eukaryotic cell all the way through a variety of organisms, leading to, in this case, fish and amphibians and mammals and humans. So macroevolution is big scale. That is, it could be the result of small changes over time, or maybe there's some other mechanisms that produce it. But understand the difference between micro and macroevolution. When someone speaks of microevolution, we're talking about subtle, small changes in gene pools that may lead to differences, that may lead to adaptation for a particular environment. Macroevolution are the bigger changes. The features that would lead, the differences that would go from a fish to an amphibian are going to be far more substantial than a gene allele or two. So that difference is important. When we talk about speciation then, it's the formation of new species. Over here, this microevolution did not result in new species, right? Breeds are all examples of one species. but obviously these represent different groups. So let's figure out what speciation is. That will help. First, just remind ourselves of what a species is again. Recall our definition is a species is just going to be a group of individuals, a population that can reproduce only with themselves and produce healthy, fertile offspring. So, fair question to ask then is how do we get new species? Speciation is the process, speciation is the process of producing new species, and you can see it looks like this. If you have an original population, if something causes that population to split so that you have two separate groups, over time they may become two separate groups that can no longer intermate, and therefore they are separate species. So how does this happen? What event where's my cursor? What event causes this to happen? This could be, you see some examples here, time or space or genetics. Something may separate this group in physically, something may separate this group in terms of behavioral changes, even genetic changes may make a group sort of split into two non-interbreeding entities. Here's an example. We have this big hole in the ground out west called the Grand Canyon. Well, there's squirrels on either side of this that genetically we can show they were of one ancestral species that goes back many, many years. However, when the Grand Canyon was formed over many thousands of years and gradually the populations became separated, these squirrels on this side cannot go to this side and vice versa. So the squirrels over here became a separate group from these. If you were to airdrop these squirrels onto this side, we don't do this, but let's pretend. If we airdrop these squirrels over to this side, they become so different now after being separated for so long, they won't intermate. Perhaps it's behavioral differences, perhaps there's slight differences in their chromosomes or in the formation of zygotes to where they just will not intermate. They are now considered separate species. And by the way, hopefully you can recognize that in their names. You see here's the genus, so they are of the same genus, but you see that there's now different species indications. So if you have populations that separate or separated by some barrier, in this case a physical barrier, the Grand Canyon, then the populations each become different. Why? Well, on each side of the Grand Canyon there might be slight differences in the environments, or there can be some other factors. I mentioned some other evolutionary mechanisms that could be operating that simply make those populations no longer able to intermate even if you put them back together. So if that's the case, they meet the definition of a species. They are two non-interbreeding populations. Let me clean up. Here we go. So as I mentioned before, those small changes, the microevolution may not result in the big changes we associate with macroevolution. It might be a part of it. But we have seen throughout the history of life on Earth, many novel features have evolved. And these are very interesting to biologists because they may have been those big pushes to cause big changes in populations that cause essentially macroevolution. Here's one example. This is Cototeryx. This means tail feather. This is an interesting dinosaur / bird, depending on your perspective. This is a peacock-sized organism that lived 125 million years ago, and we have several fossils of this. This clearly, in the fossils we have, clearly displays feathers, and it has other bird-like features. Now, there's a lot of controversy about this because is this a dinosaur-like bird? Is it a bird-like dinosaur? That's probably a discussion for somebody else. This is, most people consider this the Oviraptorsauria. It's actually considered by most people to be a dinosaur, but for some they consider it a bird. It doesn't really matter which way we classify it. Let's focus on the idea that this organism has feathers. Feathers probably were most associated early on with thermoregulation. This thing can't fly. it does have feathers. We associate, of course, feathers with birds today, and most birds, not all birds, but most birds fly. Ostriches don't, and penguins don't, and there's other ones that we associate as birds that don't fly. Let's move past that. But the important point here is that feathers probably evolved as a thermoregulation device, as a novel feature, as a novel characteristic. Later on, they became highly beneficial for flight. The point is that you can have these big changes that may actually spur macroevolution that go beyond just those small changes in genes, the small changes in the gene pool. These big changes that happen every so often, like the evolution of feathers, may really have pushed macroevolution in a big way. I also want to mention this idea that we've seen quite a bit, which is rapid species diversification follows mass extinctions. There have been multiple mass extinctions on the Earth since the origin of life. From 3.8 billion years ago to the present, there's been 5 very massive mass extinctions. The one we're associating with this one here is the the extinction of the dinosaurs. They bit the dust about 65 million years ago. But if you have a dominant group like the dinosaurs that had taken over the place and they had been dominant for 100 million years plus, and all of a sudden they're gone, that leads to some wide open opportunities for some rapid evolution. That is, the organisms that were left after the extinction rapidly could change because the dinosaurs were no longer in charge of the water, in charge of the land, in charge of everything. And now we see this evolution of these other groups like elephants and bisons, and the mammals really took off following the extinction of the dinosaurs. So think about it. If all of a sudden all of the McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger Kings and all the fast food places were gone tomorrow, and you open up a hamburger stand, you could do a lot in a hurry because there's a little less competition. So we see this also happen too, is that following a mass extinction, you can have a lot of rapid evolution because there's less competition. So novel features, whenever they show up like we see in feathers, or when we have these mass extinctions, those are huge factors in spurring on some major evolution. And let me close with just this idea about evolutionary relationships. When we try to represent what we understand about evolution and patterns, we develop these things called phylogenetic trees. These are ways that we try to use to try to represent how related things are to each other. In this tree, we think that A and B are pretty closely related. They share an ancestor. Here, we think that C has been genetically apart from them or further apart from them for a longer period of time. So we have C kind of off to itself. But even this, we're saying that A, B, and C are related through these mechanisms. I should probably change colors. But these trees represent hypotheses or represent our best understanding of how things are interrelated and interconnected. So when you see these large trees, this is one that I've seen recently, they show how we believe things are related to each other in a big scheme of things. For example, tetrapods. All these things here are going to be those that came from a group that had 4 legs. And some of these, like you see chickens here, or you see humans. Well, we don't have 4 legs. No, but the ancestry of that shows that linkage. And these trees kind of give us relationship insights. What's connected to what? What's most related to what? And interestingly, and then we'll close with this, they kind of reflect what Darwin was thinking about. And when Darwin envisioned this tree of life and this branching of relationships, this is what he included in his journal, which of course is what we are basically talking about here, showing the interconnections of everything. That does it for this video. We've got one more for this homework assignment, and we're done. Thank you.